feel like it's this stripping away and healing of this unhealthy colonialist endeavor whereby we
Yeah.
go and take kids in Kenya and make them look like little Westerners. And so
Yeah.
I feel like that needs to connect up with these conversations about Jew and Gentile, because what it
Yeah.
looks like for me as a Jew to follow Yeshua authentically is not the same as what it's going to look
Yeah.
like for you or for people in South Korea.
Well, welcome back to another episode of the Covenant and Conflict podcast. We have today my favorite TKU professor, the King's University, Dr. Jen Rosner. She is with us from the beautiful state of California. Thank you for being with us. We're so happy you're here.
Thank you, David. It's an honor to be with you.
I say, one of these days you're going to have to come down to Dallas, but there's not much that we can bribe you with coming from Northern California.
You know what? Just hanging out with all of you is gift enough. So,
Hey, there you go.
it'll happen eventually.
That's all we got. All we got is you can see
It's
us.
plenty. It's
You can't
plenty.
see anything beautiful in nature, but you can see us. Well, we're excited that you're here. You are a professor at the King's University, but that's not nearly the only thing you do. You're a prolific author in the Messianic Jewish space. You've helped us with language and theological concepts. You've dove so deeply into this world, but tell us a little bit more about what you do.
Yeah, so I am an author. I'm currently working on a new book that
Praise God.
actually deals quite a bit with Jew and Gentile identity in
Great.
Messiah. So I do write. My last book was called Finding Messiah, which was kind of part memoir, part biblical, theological, historical reflections,
Yeah.
kind of geared towards a broader audience.
Yeah.
I teach for TKU, which I love. I also teach for a number of other schools, including Fuller Theological Seminary
Yeah.
and Azusa Pacific University, as well as Messianic Jewish Theological Institute, which is another Messianic Jewish educational institution.
Yeah.
So I wear lots of hats, and
So
I do
good.
most of it from my home office, and I consider it a privilege to be able to
Yeah.
speak into and engage in these kinds of conversations.
That's so good. Well, we need you to wear as many hats as possible because we need this message to go out to as many people as possible. Will you tell us a little bit about just your story? I know that was kind of what your most recent book was kind of how you found Yeshua. Can you give us a little synopsis of kind of what your life was before that? Were you
Mhm.
traditionally, Jewish, customs, the high holidays, or was it, more of just a cultural thing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was born and raised in a Jewish home in Lake Tahoe, California, which is where I am after sort of a long circuitous route. I'm back in my hometown now,
That's
which
great.
is a bit of a trip, but also a gift. And so both of my parents were raised in the Jewish community in Los Angeles, kind of different iterations of that. My dad was raised in the conservative Jewish community. My mom was raised in the Reformed Jewish community. They got married and kind of wanted out of the big city. And so they got married and moved to Lake Tahoe, where they have been ever since.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. My dad saw a lot of hypocrisy in and kind of shallowness in the Jewish circles that he was raised in. So he kind of moved away from that. And but he also had this sort of deep abiding faith in God. I sort of, looking back on my childhood, I would call it like non-contextual monotheism. Like he didn't have much use
Yeah.
for Judaism, but he instilled in my brother and I a very deep faith in God that was sort
Yeah.
of an anchor in our lives. And my mom was still very attached to, she was like the Jewish camp counselor growing up, and she loved Jewish culture, Jewish ritual, Jewish tradition. And so she tried very hard to keep that alive in our home. So
Yeah.
we were not part of like a synagogue community growing up. At the time, there was only like a Reform temple in Lake Tahoe, and my parents just didn't find it to be a good fit. But we did practice Judaism in the home, so we would have a Passover Seder every year. We would light Hanukkah candles every year.
Yeah.
I would say I had a fairly strong sense of Jewish identity as a kid,
Yeah.
but I also wasn't totally sure what to do with that. There weren't a lot of
Yeah.
Jews in our community. We didn't have a lot of Jewish friends, so it was kind of this like isolated part of my identity
Yeah.
that I was aware of, but not, as I said, I didn't really know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And so I went away to college to a large public state school in California called Cal Poly, and it was a really interesting, informative season of my life because it sort of just so happened that all of my friends as a college freshman were Christians, and it was a
Mm.
really interesting time at this particular school where the there was just I sort of just say God was on the move. You know,
Yeah.
there was a lot of Christians there, and the campus crusade, which is now called Cru at my college
Yeah.
campus, went from like 30 kids to 500 kids in a 5 year period, and
Wow.
that's when I was there. So there was a lot going on. There was a lot of energy.
Yeah.
My kind of randomly assigned freshman roommate was a Christian. My next door neighbor in the freshman dorms was a Christian who she became my best friend. So it was for me, and this is so crazy looking back because I did have Christian friends growing up, but it was the first time as a college student that I ever
Mm.
like heard the gospel, that I ever like knew who the person of Jesus was.
Yeah.
And like I said, that's crazy to me that I never really knew who Jesus was before that,
Yeah.
even though I had a Catholic friend growing up and I went to mass with her a couple times, but I never knew what any of it was about until I was in college and
Yeah.
had all these Christian friends. And they like thought that it was really special that I was Jewish. And they would say things like, oh my gosh, God's chosen people, the 144,000. And I was like,
Of course,
whoa,
they'd bring
I don't,
revelations into it.
right. And I did not know what to do with that. But I was also, I was kind of intrigued by them and their faith.
Yeah.
And it's funny because it wasn't a religious school at all, but I didn't like being the only kid in the dorms on a Sunday morning because so many people in my dorm were Christians and went to church. So I started going to church with them. I started going to Campus Crusade with friends. And so college for me really became a searching time of like, who
Yeah.
is this person, Jesus, and does that matter to me?
Yeah.
And I just remember being deeply impacted by sermons and conversations with friends. And so by the end of my undergraduate program, I, through a, interesting set of circumstances, came to a place of faith. Like, I think that this person, Jesus, is who he said he was. And I think that does matter for me and for everyone
Yeah.
else. But at that point, I had no idea what to do with my Jewishness. Like
Yeah.
I had no model for how to be a Jewish follower of Jesus. I didn't even know of anything called the Messianic Jewish movement, Jews for Jesus, like nothing, had never heard of
Yeah.
anything. I had Jewish friends in college, but they were all completely secular. And so for a while, I just kind of put my Jewish identity on a shelf and I
Yeah.
kind of went wholesale into the Christian world. I became a follower of Jesus in the context of a vineyard church. So to this day, am deeply impacted by vineyard theology. And then I was a political science major in college, planning to go on to law school. And once I became a follower of Jesus, um, I was just hooked. Like I just wanted more. And so I
Yeah.
scrapped my plans to go to law school and instead I went to divinity school
Mm.
as like someone who didn't know anything about anything pretty much, but I took a
Yeah.
year off after college and I like read through the whole Bible and read every book I could get my hands on and then I went to Yale Divinity School.
Wow.
And I was like a kid in a candy shop for 3 years of an MDiv program, just taking biblical languages and church history and systematic theology and
Yeah.
all these classes. And it was actually there after kind of bouncing around in a number of different Christian denominations that through an interesting set of circumstances, the Jewish piece of my identity began to kind of clamor for attention again. And I sort
Mm.
of realized
Good.
that I had left something really fundamental behind and that there was a
Wow.
reason I wasn't finding a denominational home in the Christian world because
Wow.
that wasn't my home. And so
Yeah.
I finished up my MDiv. I came back to California and started a PhD program at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. And it was my first year at Fuller that I was introduced to Mark Kinzer, who is a very influential voice in the Messianic Jewish movement.
Yeah.
And he very quickly became a close friend, mentor, now colleague to me, has been ever since. And
Yeah.
so it was really through meeting Mark and lots of people through him connected to him
Yeah.
that I began to sort of wrestle with what does it look like to follow Jesus or Yeshua like as a Jew,
Yeah.
which was a totally new paradigm. Like these were these two separate worlds for me that I never knew
Yeah.
what to do with that. And so I feel like both my personal and professional life ever since has been like asking and wrestling with that question,
Yeah.
both in our family as well as
Yeah.
in my scholarship and teaching. It's really neat for me that my story gets to, overlap so closely with my vocation. So
Yeah.
so that's kind of a snapshot of the story,
So good.
and it's, I would say it's very ongoing, depending on where we
Yeah.
live, what our community is, what our context is,
Yeah.
and what it looks like for us to kind of navigate that
Yeah.
piece.
It's so good. And it reminds me, you're talking about your journey. And what
Mhm,
you're saying is your journey is not over. You're
mhm,
still on this journey. And, I was talking to probably 30 or 40 staff members at Gateway
mhm,
just about, I talked about the three pools of the Jewish plunge is what I called it. And it
mhm,
was replacement, olive tree, or one law. And how
mhm,
one law and replacement are the ends of the spectrum. There's
mhm,
softer versions of them.
mhm,
And then we're all trying to get to this olive tree, which is we're a part of Israel, but we're not Israel. We're adopted into the family, so we're in the family, but we are different. And
mhm,
like male and female, there's a distinction, but there's still desire to be unity, but unity doesn't mean uniformity. So there's all this constant nuance
mhm,
that we're all on a journey. And I was
mhm,
talking to someone yesterday, and they were kind of saddened because they had jumped into what I call the Jewish plunge. They jumped into the Jewish stuff
mhm,
and started doing all of it, and then realizing, well, do I need to be doing all of it because I'm a Gentile? And
mhm.
then they came to this place, well, being a Gentile sucks. you know,
Yes,
we can't do
yes.
anything. Like we're not even cool anymore, And but I saw echoes of my own journey of being like, yeah, like there's you go into this Jewish world and you realize so much of what you had understood about the Bible
Mhm,
is either false or it's just so much deeper. And so then
mhm,
you want to latch onto it, but then, the enemy finds his way anywhere,
mhm,
whatever path we take. It's like he finds his way to then get us to latch onto this identity so strongly that, in as David Rudolph, who I know you
mhm,
also
mhm.
know and love, he says, the one law is one new Gentile, and the replacement is, or no, one replacement theology is one new Gentile, and
Um,
one law is one new Jew.
mhm,
Either way, there's not one new man.
mhm,
So you're someone that we've used many times to help explain
mhm,
what it means to wrestle with Jewish identity and
mhm,
Jewish observance. Because at the church, and for
mhm,
most Gentiles, the Old Testament is old, it's done away with.
mhm, mhm,
It's spiritual, it's figurative, it's an analogy. But as a Jewish person,
mhm,
that's your roots,
mhm,
and Jewish identity continues. So, can you talk a little bit about what does it mean to live a Jewish life and to
mhm,
maintain Jewish identity while following Yeshua, which makes
mhm,
sense, the
mhm, mhm.
Jewish Messiah, and maybe how you've had to wrestle with that over the years and kind
Mhm.
of where you're at now on this journey.
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like there's so many layers to what you're talking about, and I have seen so many times what you were describing this conversation with this other person where, and we can get to this. I know it's a little bit far off from where we are right now,
Yeah,
but in this conversation, but where Gentiles are made to sometimes feel less than, and that's
yeah,
something that just really grieves me. It's actually the main thing that I'm trying to get at in my next book, because
mm,
I feel like it's not necessarily something that the Messianic Jewish movement intentionally perpetuates,
yeah,
but it's a subtle message that I think
yeah,
it comes across pretty strongly in certain
yeah,
circles and communities that I've been a part of, and I just don't think that's right. I don't think that's
yeah,
what we see in the New Testament. You used probably drawing from Paul, Galatians 3:28, like where he talks about Jew and Greek. We could sort of extrapolate Jew and Gentile
yeah,
as a putting up against male and female, and it's kind of the same thing if women were to feel less than, because you know what I'm saying,
yeah,
like there's
totally.
something that's amiss there if that's where we end up.
Yep.
And yet it's not all that surprising, because the Messianic Jewish movement is a relatively new movement. For much of the history of the Christian church,
Yeah.
Jews who entered the church had to renounce all aspects of Jewish identity. Like, it really wasn't an option. I mean, we see
Yeah.
this in the New Testament, the first centuries after, the coming of Messiah, where you have this kind of community where, at least according to, I would say, the New Testament, it seems that Jews are living as Jews, Gentiles are not required to do that.
Yeah.
But that becomes an impossibility pretty quickly,
Yeah.
whereby one has to then choose which community to be a part of. And so
Yeah.
it makes sense that in the, latter half of the 20th century, with the emergence of the modern Messianic Jewish movement, there's all of this kind of reclaiming of what it
Yeah.
means to be a Jewish follower of Messiah. Like, again, Mark Kinzer's work, lots of these Messianic Jewish pioneering thinkers have worked so hard to carve out space for how we as Jewish followers of Messiah
Yeah.
ought to and can live. And I feel like there's been so much said about that, and I can actually answer your question and talk more about what that looks like for us.
Yeah.
But I feel like what hasn't been said, there's so much emphasis on like Jewish followers of Jesus reclaiming this
Yeah.
space, that there hasn't been a lot said about what does that mean for Gentiles. And I
Yeah.
think it's sort of, again, it perpetuates, however unintentionally,
Yeah.
this notion that, like, oh,
Really.
it's a little bit second class to be a Gentile in the family of
Yeah.
God. And I just think that's so opposite of what the New Testament is saying,
Yeah.
that I really desire to increasingly speak into that space.
Yeah. It's so good.
Um, so yeah, I mean, to actually answer your
Yeah.
question,
No, that
it
was
has been
great.
a journey to figure out what that looks like for us. And
Yeah.
the sort of part of my story that I didn't share is that after I finished my PhD at Fuller, I met my husband, who is also a Messianic Jew, and he had made Aliyah to Israel after high school. So we met in Israel. He had been living in Israel already for a decade, and we dated long distance for a year, got married, spent the first 2 years of our marriage in Israel,
Mm.
where it looks very different to live as a Jewish follower of
Yeah.
Yeshua. Like, it's just
Yeah.
kind of going with the flow to observe Shabbat and Jewish
Yeah.
holidays. We were a part of different Messianic groups, but we also just worshiped at traditional Jewish synagogues where
Yeah.
there's one on every corner.
Yeah.
And so I think for us, the context that we're in has really made a difference in
Yeah.
terms of what that looks like, and
Yeah.
what is even realistic.
Yeah.
Like, we don't drive on Shabbat, and what that means is that it's very hard for us to fellowship with a Messianic Jewish congregation, because the closest Messianic Jewish congregation to where we are right now is 2 hours away. So, like, unless we carve out a whole weekend and go there, which is not always feasible financially
Yeah.
and in terms of other constraints.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's as I said earlier, it's an ongoing journey in terms of what does this look like, and
Yeah.
what are what do we need to be flexible with, and what are
Yeah.
kind of foundation cornerstones. We have kids now, so we're trying to instill in them this identity.
Yeah.
And it's tricky. It's
Yeah.
tricky to navigate. In some ways, in Israel, it was much easier to do that because there's not baseball games on Shabbat. Like,
Yeah.
we're having to navigate a lot of these things with our kids now.
Yeah.
And it's far from straightforward. But I
Yeah.
think there's something about that also feels very rich to me. Like, we're finding our way
Yeah.
on a path that's largely uncharted. There's
Yeah.
not a lot of precedence of how to do this, and so there's something that also feels very meaningful as
Yeah.
we have these conversations
Yeah.
about how to navigate all the tensions that exist.
Yeah. It reminds me of a story. I think it was a man who, Jewish believer in Yeshua, wrestling with what it means to be Jewish now, because you kind of have two sides pulling at you. You have the church that's telling you to be more like the church and be more
Mhm,
Gentile, essentially, and then you have the
mhm,
traditional synagogue maybe pushing or pulling on you to reject that and be
mhm,
more Jewish. And in this wrestle, I think he was wrestling about whether to wear a kippah or not,
mhm,
which we can get into because you have these commands that are extra biblical. They're not in the Bible, but the Jewish community at large has embraced them. And
mhm,
what authority do those rabbis have?
mhm,
And I believe where he ended was, I'm gonna put the kippah on. It's a not as a biblical command, but as an expression of Jewish identity and
mhm,
my heritage. And he said the wrestle is what makes me Jewish. And then it
mhm,
was this
mhm,
moment of realizing, well, Israel wrestle with God. So
mhm,
what makes me a part of Israel, it is that I'm wrestling. And it's almost the idea that if we stop the journey, if we stop wrestling with it and we make it this finite decision, this is it, this is what Jewish life is, and this is what Jewish life isn't, we're done,
Mhm.
then we might, ceasingly stop being part of Israel because we stopped wrestling. We stopped wrestling with this issue. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I thought that was
Mhm.
helpful for me,
Yeah.
and frustrating, because then you realize you're never gonna necessarily have all the answers.
But I feel like Jews are much more careful with not having, are much more comfortable with not having the answers than Christians are, right?
Yeah,
Christian theology over the centuries has been so kind of obsessed with nailing down correct doctrine. This
so
is why we have
true.
creeds and councils. And I
So
feel like
true.
Judaism has always been more comfortable with tensions. And I think that
Yeah.
that is, it can be frustrating. But one of my favorite quotes, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm probably going to misquote it, is from a woman named Blue Greenberg, who is, she was kind of one of the first women to be navigating a different tension, which is the tension
Yeah.
between Orthodox Judaism and feminism,
Mm.
which is, we're not talking about that, but gosh, are there some tensions
Yeah.
there, right? And there's
Totally.
been a lot of people who've come after her who are wrestling with similar tensions, and she wrote a quote. Again, we can post it somewhere because this isn't going to be exact, but she said something like, there's 1,000 tensions that I wrestle with every day, and I've come to realize that those are a sign of my strength, not a sign of my weakness, and that they're a sign of the richness of my life, not of its disorderliness. And so it's just
Yeah.
this whole idea of embracing the tensions
Yeah.
and sort of just living with them, and
Yeah.
not even necessarily seeking to like nail it all down and resolve everything,
Yeah.
which for me is very much how I approach theology in general. Like, I don't think the goal should be, by the end of this class or by the end of this book, like we're going to
Yeah.
nail it all down. I think
Yeah.
there's something to be said for just embracing the tensions and
Yeah.
just sort of living in that place and realizing that it is a sign of like the richness of our identity, whatever, whether that's Gentile identity, Jewish identity, just to sort of embrace the tensions as
Yeah.
opposed to see them as some kind of threat or something to be conquered. That's been a
Yeah.
huge kind of paradigm shift for me,
Totally.
that I think really influences, also because I think it gets away from the kind of there's one right answer. Like for your
Yeah.
friend that you were talking about, like maybe there's seasons where he, will wear a kippah and seasons where he won't, and maybe that's okay. Like
Yeah.
maybe it's not about finding the exact right, expression or outward, appearance type,
Yeah.
whatever. I think there's just freedom to say these
Yeah.
are hard tensions. There isn't there's not a lot of people who've gone before us. And
Yeah.
so that's really helped me as I continue to
Yeah.
wrestle with so many tensions.
Yeah. That's so true. And what you're saying about the church, I think that's something that I've seen. I was a youth pastor for 7 years. I think the next generation is, if we're going to put it aggressively, rejecting, if you put it kindly,
Mm,
maybe just questioning, is the uh, the arrogance of many church leaders to say
mm,
this is the right way and every other way is wrong, or I'm going to read this Bible verse and here is the interpretation,
mm,
not the interpretation that I believe has the most
mm,
valid arguments.
mm,
And because what it does is, especially when you're young, it paints this picture that there is a black and white in all
mm,
things.
mm,
And
mm,
I'm not saying there's not black and white. We clearly know there are certain things that are,
mm,
right, wrong, black, white, but so much of it is in
mm,
this area of tension, and we actually do a disservice to the next generation
mm,
when we don't provide the the the
mm,
kaleidoscope of commentaries and scholarship that's been done on these issues, because when you grow up and then you feel like you've been fed a lie, like, oh, well, I was told this was the only right way. And I remember the first time I experienced that was in Jewish ministry, when I get around, whether it was Jewish believers or Orthodox or even Christians in the kind of Jewish Christian space. You go to Israel and they'd be like, yeah, there's a lot of scholarship that leads us to believe that right around this general region, this is where, and you're like, whoa, I thought you were the expert. I want to know exactly where this happened. And it's like, oh, we can't do that. That was, 2,000 years ago. And you're like, oh, well, my Western bubbles pop because I thought if you're an
mm.
expert, that means that you had every detailed answer.
Right.
And they
Yeah.
don't. but
No,
then it's freeing.
it's interesting. I teach also at Fuller Seminary, which I mentioned, which is, Christians, most of them preparing for ministry or already engaged in
Yeah.
ministry. And I teach a class on Judaism and Jewish Christian relations, which is so fun because it's the only class at Fuller that exists of its kind.
Yeah.
And I recently was teaching this class, and I assigned an essay for them to read by Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi of Great Britain. He's like, one of the 20th century's most beloved Jewish thinkers,
Yeah.
passed away kind of during COVID. And I was having them read this chapter of one of his books the chapter's called Faith as Protest. And he talks about how that's always been like, he connects this sort of the heart of Jewish faith with what it means to be a Jewish parent. And it's
Mm.
honestly like I've read a lot of parenting books, and this one chapter from Jonathan Sacks has been more influential for me as a parent than any parenting book I've read, because he says that
Good.
to raise a Jewish child is to raise a child to question and to challenge and to confront and to sort of always be not in like necessarily a disrespecting of authority kind of way, but always
Yeah.
like, why is it this way and not this way?
Inquisitive.
And
Yeah.
why inquisitive? Exactly. And
Yeah.
what was so interesting to me is that my Christian students, multiple students, remarked about how that's so different than spiritual formation for children in a lot of church settings, where
Yeah.
there's so much just kind of like rehearsing, reiterating, almost like in some cases like regurgitating, like this is what we
Totally.
believe, this is what we believe, this is what we believe, and there
Yeah.
isn't always that room to kind of why don't we believe this? And
Yeah.
I get it, like you do want to give your child and your students and whoever it may be a firm foundation, but
Totally.
I agree with you that
Yeah.
we sort of do a disservice when we don't. And it's interesting as a Jewish person being in settings where, I think about my mom who, that's a whole other story. We haven't talked much about my parents, but she went to a Christian Bible study with like a women's Bible study at a church. And she just was like, what? Like she had so many questions, and they were just like so threatened by that. And as a Jewish
Yeah.
woman, she's like, what? This is what we do, and
Yeah.
there just wasn't space for that. And so I think
Yeah.
creating space for the wrestling and just kind
Yeah.
of honoring it is
Yeah.
I think it's very, as you're saying, very fundamental to Jewish thought and
Yeah.
Jewish
Totally.
identity. And I think it's something to kind of press into.
Yeah. I use this term a lot, and whether it's theologically accurate or not, we can talk about. But it's holy discontent, which is like
Mm-hmm.
righteous anger. It's been labeled. It's this thing that you're like, oh, this makes me so upset. But hopefully in a righteous way. It's something's off with the church, or something's off with God's people, and we need to realign. And so I'll have different seasons where I'm like, oh, this is really what I'm angry at right now, or this is what I'm really trying to wrestle with. And for me right now, it's I call it milk-based Christianity, and it's just this
Mm-hmm.
idea that we give young Christian children or youth a very watered down message, because we want to lay, like you're saying, we want to lay a foundation, and we want to make it simple so they can grasp it, and then we never add on to it. We never come back around and say, hey, when I told you Trinity 3 in 1, it's actually a little bit more complex than that. Let's talk about the divinity of Jesus, and praying to Jesus, and what it means to pray to the Father, and where Jesus sits in that unity of Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And Christians are like, stop. Like, Jesus is God. And you're like, yes. So let's talk about that. What does that mean? But we're actually setting them up for failure, because they're going to start to ask these questions eventually, unless they're, shutting themselves out from those conversations, and then they don't have answers for it. And then they feel like the church did them a disservice, or the church lied to them, or they can't trust the church. And so we're actually creating our own problem. But I say that to say, what is on your heart right now when you look at the Jewish Christian world, the Jewish Christian relationship, the Messianic world? What is your kind of like righteous anger right now that you're like, oh, we need to get clear on this, that you're spending a lot of time thinking and praying about?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I do resonate with what you shared as well, and I think Yeah, I take a lot of comfort in the fact that God is leading and guiding the
Yeah.
church as well as leading and guiding the Jewish people, even in the midst of their schism from one another, which sort of
Yeah.
could circle back to the, authority of the rabbis kinds of questions.
Yeah.
But I think for me, it's something that we've already talked about. It's this notion, because I find it so exciting. I find what we're seeing in our day so exciting in terms of the rebirth of the Messianic Jewish movement
Yeah.
and a lot of scholarship that isn't Messianic. We could talk about the Paul within Judaism school of
Yeah.
Pauline scholarship, all of this New Testament scholarship, biblical scholarship that is really, it's just, I think it's an incredible era that we're living in.
Totally.
And the thing that makes me the most frustrated is when Gentiles feel less than. Like
Yeah.
that's the thing that
Yeah.
really, again, it grieves me so deeply because I
Yeah.
don't think, like, as I read the New Testament, Yeshua came as a light to the nations, right? As a
Yeah.
way by which those from the nations can enter covenant relationship with God
Yeah.
alongside the people of Israel as the nations. And that's exactly what makes it so remarkable to have Jew and Gentile worshiping side by side in the body of Messiah, is that we remain different. Just as you
Yeah.
brought up earlier with the marriage analogy that I think Paul uses very intentionally.
Yeah.
And so it's so, we could talk about one law and Hebrew roots and like the different ways that that's gone, but I really want to see um, Gentiles embracing like particular Gentile identity. And so
Yeah.
it's fascinating to me because this actually parallels what we've been seeing in the missiological world, the world of sort of Christian missions, where there's been this radical shift over the last 50 years from like sort of Western colonial sort of missions where people from the West or the North go to the South and the East and they sort of export Christianity alongside like Western culture and commerce and all of these like
Yeah.
really ugly colonial things.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is contemporary missiology is all about helping the gospel to find unique expression in every culture that it encounters. And
Yeah.
so there's just so much richness to that. So it's, again, I feel like it's this stripping away and healing of this unhealthy colonialist endeavor whereby
Yeah.
we go and take kids in Kenya and make them look like little Westerners. And so
Yeah.
I feel like that needs to connect up with these conversations about Jew and Gentile, because what it
Yeah.
looks like for me as a Jew to follow Yeshua authentically is not the same as what it's going to look
Yeah.
like for you or for people in South Korea. Do you know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah. Totally.
I really I want to see us kind of raising the theological profile of Gentile identity. Like it's, God
Yeah.
didn't make a mistake, just like he didn't make a mistake in creating men and women. Like there's a reason why there's Jews and there's Gentiles. There's a reason why there's, all of these the nations that we see all
Yeah.
throughout the Bible, right? Like the nations still exist when we get to Revelation. You have people from every tongue and every tribe. Like there's
Yeah.
something about God's intentionality with
Yeah.
the diversity of human identity. And so it just really saddens me when like this story that you shared earlier about, Gentiles who sort of feel drawn to Judaism because they feel like it's more authentic or it's more like what, Yeshua
Yeah.
was about, or it's closer to biblical practices or
Yeah.
whatever. And then maybe realizing like, wait, that's not for me. But then like, I'm just like, what's left? Like it's
Yeah.
just kind of boring. It's not cool anymore to be a
Not
Gentile. I'm
rooted in
like, no, it's,
anything. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so I just feel like there's so much there to unpack.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned earlier, I feel like it's kind of the flip side of what Messianic Jewish theology has been hammering on for probably the last 20 years, which is like, no, as Jews, we need space to live as Jews, but nobody's talking about how does all of that transfer, especially as it goes hand in hand with new trends in biblical scholarship, etc. What does that mean for Gentiles? Like
Yeah.
that's really what I want to press into, because it saddens me to see this almost like unspoken two-class society in some of
Totally.
these circles. Like it seems like it's a little bit cooler to be a Jew, or like you're a little bit closer to God. And I'm like, no, no, no.
Yeah.
Let's unpack that and let's undo that thinking, because I don't think that's at all what we see
Yeah.
in the Bible as a whole, and certainly not in the New Testament.
Yeah.
So that for me is
So good.
it's kind of what keeps me up at night these days.
Well, and there's so much that I am still confused about when it comes to the nations,
Mm-hmm.
because that word is so all encompassing.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do see in scripture is God constantly trying to bring diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like God's trying to send his people out
Mm-hmm.
and go and have different culture
Mm-hmm.
uh, and tongues and worship me in your individual cultures, in your diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And we always want to come back together and rebuild this Tower of Babel where we're same language, same culture, one
Mm-hmm.
size fits all.
Mm-hmm.
And God's constantly like, no, go
Mm-hmm.
back again. And
Mm-hmm.
it seems like we're doing that. And I think we did that with the church being the one big building that we're gonna all come around the same language and same culture. And now in this world, it can, the Messianic world, it can be this, we're all gonna be Jewish together, and we're all gonna come
Mm-hmm.
back to the kind of the roots. So most of our listeners are probably Gentile, as is
Mm-hmm.
most of the world is Gentile.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say are maybe helpful steps that they could do as they wrestle with what does Gentile identity
Mm-hmm.
mean to follow
Mm-hmm.
Jesus in my culture, in my context, without, you know, stiff arming anything Jewish, because that's obviously not the
Mm-hmm.
answer,
Mm-hmm.
and not spiritualizing everything. So,
Mm-hmm.
what can people do? How can people start?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it's important to kind of map the spectrum as you did a little bit earlier. Like, on one hand, you have the kind of Hebrew roots, one law, like everybody should just be Jewish kind of thing.
Yeah,
And on the other hand, you have this kind of replacement theology, like we're done with Judaism, we're done with the Old Testament, like out with the
yeah,
old and with the new. And what's interesting, I was speaking a moment ago about this whole sort of like missiological paradigm where it's all about like bringing the gospel to the nations in
yeah,
these unique incarnations of gospel expression,
yeah,
and that world has tended to be very replacement theology like Israel
mm,
doesn't matter anymore. And so I think
yeah,
again it's kind of trying to avoid these extremes, and like you said earlier, and David Rudolph has written about like trying to find this sort of olive tree, like Jews and Gentiles together. So I think that I always get asked like, should Christians have Passover Seder's? Like that's like such a pressing question for
yeah,
people who are concerned about honoring Yeshua's Jewishness, and that God's covenant with Israel and understanding that. And so I think that it's always trying to avoid these two extremes. And I think what really is at the heart of that is honoring difference. Again, I as you do, come back a lot to the sort of marriage analogy.
yeah,
Um, but so what does it look like for Gentiles from the nations, whatever that might be, like in
yeah,
Dallas, Texas, or in South Korea or Kenya or wherever that might be? I would want to ask, what does it look like to honor one's unique, and that's where I say particular Gentile identity, because Gentile identity is not a monolithic thing,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
that's the whole point. It's this
totally,
very exquisite tapestry of
yeah,
difference that is
totally,
how God intended it.
yeah,
So what does that look like? And this is where I think we can learn a lot from Christian missions, from Christian missiology in the last 50 years of like trying to figure out,
yeah,
there's all these fancy terms like contextualization and enculturation and like all of these ways, like
yeah,
what does it look like for the gospel to encounter these different cultures? But what I would want to say is you're still being sort of grafted into this pre-existing covenant that God has had with Israel. So how does
yeah,
that bear upon, and this is all pretty theoretical, how does that bear upon Gentile identity, thinking that Gentiles are now grafted in to this Jewish tree, to this
yeah,
Jewish root? So I think it's another one of these tensions. But I think the first thing that I would want to tackle is the language that creates a kind of less than mentality. Like, let's go there first. Like, what is it that I would say the Messianic Jewish movement, unfortunately, and I would say unwittingly, has
yeah,
perpetuated in terms of making Gentiles feel like their identity is somehow less in the kingdom of God. Like,
yeah,
let's talk about that. Let's read our New Testaments and see what
yeah,
they have to say about that, because I don't think that's what's going on in the New Testament. In fact, I think it's this great, um, you know, kind of miracle, this work of God, that those from the nations are following Messiah without becoming Jewish. Like that was the miracle of what
Yeah,
Yeshua's ministry was all about.
totally.
So let's kind of go back to that and sort of imagine, and obviously
Good.
you can't rewind history, right? We don't live in the first century context, and so
Yeah.
there's going to have to be a lot of sort of cultural translation. But I think where I would start is trying to dismantle that language
Yeah.
and the ideas behind it, whereby it does even subtly seem like there's kind of this two-class society,
Yeah.
because I think somewhere we're misreading our Bibles if that's what we end up with. So
Yeah.
that's not super practical, but I think it's a huge topic,
Yeah.
and um, something that I hope to increasingly be kind of unpacking in my own work, because I think in
Yeah.
these circles that you and I sort of speak into, it's a really big issue.
Yeah. That's so good. Well, that hence there's gonna have to be a part two to the interview, because there are questions like, when you begin to try and translate or recapitulate or even bring in a modern context and ancient scripture,
Hmm?
then you start wrestling with, well, spirit of the law, letter of the law,
Hmm?
because that's its own spectrum.
Hmm?
Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Should we be washing people's feet, or
Mm-hmm.
was that just an ancient way of bringing yourself down to serve? And we
Hmm.
can find things in our
Hmm.
modern context.
Hmm.
So that's another tension that we'll have to manage. I'd love to talk with you about is letter of the law, spirit of the law, because I'm assuming as a Jewish person, you probably dive in that pool even more so than we do in the church of like, what does it mean to actually follow that specific command or the
Hmm.
rabbi's interpretation of that command versus what I think it means in spirit, because that can be a dangerous ground. Is that something that you've run into as
Hmm.
a Jewish follower of Jesus?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's another one of these tensions, and I would say it's one that like even in our family, my husband and I are kind of
Yeah,
constantly navigating, and we
yeah,
didn't, so far we haven't talked much about this issue that's kind of looming in the background of like rabbinic authority, like what do we make of,
yeah,
rabbis in Jewish tradition. And I mean, I see it as this continual act of navigating and
yeah,
negotiating. And like I said, I think that used to feel really kind of daunting and very exhausting for me.
yeah,
And it doesn't so much anymore. Like I see it as, um, we're seeking to honor God, and these things are not straightforward. Like it's
yeah,
not straightforward, this tension between spirit of the law, letter of law. It's not straightforward how first century
yeah,
practices translate into our context. It's, like, so
yeah,
I actually feel like it's a great honor to be wrestling with these tensions,
totally.
because it feels so meaningful to me. And
Yeah,
I again, like I just feel a certain freedom, not in the like sort of free from the law sense, but
yeah,
like freedom that like God is with us as we
yeah,
wrestle. And as I said earlier, like it's not like I'm going to land on something and necessarily like never change for the rest of my life. And I think that's
yeah,
okay. Like I think it's
yeah,
okay that we wrestle, and even to some extent like wander a little bit, like try this on and see how that feels. And
yeah,
I think especially as a parent, like it's just I have to have that, or I'm gonna just like die of like fear of failure. You know what I'm
yeah,
saying? Like there just
totally.
has to be freedom to be like,
Yeah,
okay, we're gonna let you play baseball on Shabbat, and we're gonna see how that goes. And if that doesn't work, then like there's just too
yeah,
many things to navigate that um I think I'm trying to move into a place of like this is sort of what God has placed before us, and with
yeah,
his wisdom we're going to try to navigate through these
yeah,
things. And I think, as you said, there's enough kind of nuance and variety and different opinions in Jewish tradition that it seems like we're on kind of solid ground if we're
yeah,
not on solid ground. You know what I'm
yeah,
saying? Like that's a little bit
totally.
what Judaism's always been about.
Yeah,
And I think I hope that can be a refreshing message to the
yeah,
church, that like
yeah,
it's not always going to be airtight, and
yeah,
as much as we
totally.
want it to, we're going to be always having to
Yeah,
adjust and negotiate. And that's part of the calling that we have, is
yeah,
to figure these things out as best we can, and admit when we shifted course and say
Yeah.
why and all those kinds of things. So
Yeah.
there's a lot there for sure.
Well, as you were speaking, you reminded me of a book that you wrote. So I'll give people a practical next step, which is uh, at the foot of the mountain,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Two views of Torah and the Spirit.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so this is an interesting read, not necessarily for Gentiles who are trying to sift through this,
Hmm.
particular Gentile identity, but it's such a great book because it was written by you and I believe it was your brother-in-law,
Hmm.
both Jewish, following Yeshua, but have different views on
Hmm.
how orthodox or how observant we should be with certain, Jewish customs or commands,
Hmm.
and what takes precedent. Which is I think is a very Jewish thing. It's like Rahab lied. She was like, "I ain't got no Jews in here," and you're like, "Well, she just broke one of the commands." You're like, "Yeah, but
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
greater command." You're like, "Well, that's a nuance that I don't feel like wrestling with right now."
Hmm.
But that's a great book on kind of figuring out that wrestle.
Hmm.
And as you said, like a parent, I remember having that moment as a parent where I said, if you do X, then your consequences will be Y.
Hmm.
And I just laid it down.
Hmm.
And then I was in a circumstance where one of my daughters did X, and I was getting ready to do Y, and her heart was so soft. It was so heartbroken. She was so repentant. She was just like, I'm so sorry. You're totally right. I deserve it. I shouldn't have done it. And I was like, dang it. Like, crap. And I'm wrestling with God now. Like, do I still, because I have to be a man of my word. Like,
Right. Right.
if I don't do Y, then am I breaking, the trust that I have that she can take my word? But at the same time, if her heart is soft, does that negate? And then I had this moment with the Lord where I was like, I really felt like he told me in the moment, because I was erring on I'm still gonna give her the consequence.
Mhm.
That was where I was erring in the moment, and the Lord said, "Well, sometimes I change my mind," and I
Mm.
was like, "Oh, well, then just throw everything out." Like, it's just and what I said in response, which was cheeky, was, "So I have to be spirit led for every decision I make as a parent," which I think the answer is yes. But in that
Mm.
moment, it was like, well, I don't have the energy for that. I just give me
Mhm.
the playbook, and then
Right.
realizing that I think we're never going to find the playbook. We're going to
Yeah,
have to be spirit led with the word.
that's right. That's right. It's so funny just speaking of parenting because, I can't tell you, especially when my kids were little, or how many times I like took away their treat because of like, actually, I never took away their treat. That's the point of the story. I would threaten to take away their treat, and then I don't know. It's just a whole thing. Like it,
Yeah.
then like they would always have the chance to like earn it back. I don't know what
Yeah.
sort of like theology I was perpetuating here in my parenting, but let me just tell you,
Yeah.
like 100% of the time, my kids like earned back their treat because there's no
Yeah.
playbook, like
Yeah.
yeah, I think we have to be spirit led in all the
Yeah.
decisions, and I think that's parenting has been so instructive for me in terms of being a theologian and a parent. I would say that those are
Yeah.
those are very mutually informing. I've learned a lot from my
Totally.
kids about theology.
Yeah. Totally. Well, thank you for starting this conversation and allowing us to all wrestle. But I think like you said, there is a freedom in
Hmm.
realizing, oh, I don't have to have it figured out. It's
Hmm.
not the freedom that you mentioned of freedom, like we're under grace now, so I can do whatever I want,
Hmm.
uh, which is actually torture. But a freedom that says I don't have to have it figured out all right now. I can be on a journey towards the right direction. I think it was Gene Edwards. No, what's his name? The guy that wrote the Message translation.
Oh, Eugene Peterson.
Eugene Peterson.
Hmm. Hmm.
Long
Long
obedience in the
obedience
same
in the same
direction. It's
direction.
like
Yeah.
as long as we're heading towards the Lord, we're all on a journey.
Hmm.
So thank you for allowing us to
Hmm.
wrestle through that, and we'll definitely need you to come back on because I have way more questions. So
Sounds great. Sounds great. We can only tackle so much in one show. So that sounds good. There's a lot to unpack, and it's it's
yeah,
it's really meaningful to sort of process and have the conversation with you. So thank
yeah.
you.
Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Sounds great. Thank you.